Pressure mounts U.S. advocates for swift Gaza aid distribution from Israel. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other high-ranking Israeli officials on Wednesday. Blinken, who arrived in Tel Aviv late Tuesday, is expected to discuss the effective distribution of humanitarian aid within Gaza, a region that has been suffering from hunger, disease, and hardship following over 6 months of conflict between Israel and Hamas militants. During his visit to the Jordanian capital, Blinken was briefed by UN humanitarian officials about their efforts to improve conditions in Gaza. He emphasized the importance of ensuring that the aid reaches those who need it most. To facilitate this, he suggested that additional trucks, drivers, and fuel must be allowed into Gaza, along with measures to better separate military and humanitarian operations in the ongoing conflict. Blinken's visit to the Middle East, his 7th since the start of the war triggered by the Hamas attacks of October 7, is part of the Biden administration's efforts to transform tentative increases in aid shipments into more widespread improvements for the desperate civilians in Gaza. President Biden had previously warned Netanyahu in early April that Washington would reassess its policy toward the war unless Israel made immediate, measurable changes to address the widespread civilian suffering in Gaza. Despite the challenges, Blinken remains determined to ensure that the aid works as effectively as possible. He plans to discuss with Israeli officials the necessary steps to meet the needs of the people in Gaza. Israel, on its part, has stated that it is working to improve aid delivery and to prioritize the humanitarian situation, although it has pointed out what it perceives as UN logistical failings. Blinken's visit also comes at a time when the U.S. and Israel have agreed to develop a plan to get humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza without benefiting Hamas. This agreement was reached after lengthy negotiations with Netanyahu. The U.S. has expressed concerns that Hamas may seize or destroy aid entering Gaza or prevent it from reaching the people who need it. In addition to his meetings with Israeli officials, Blinken is also expected to meet with key Arab states and Turkey to begin planning for the reconstruction and governance of Gaza once Israel's war against Hamas ends. These countries have agreed to work together to help stabilize and recover Gaza and to chart a political path forward for the Palestinians. The first direct shipment of aid from Jordan to Gaza is set to depart on Tuesday, marking a significant step in the efforts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in the region. This shipment will be sent to Erez, a border crossing point into Gaza that Israel announced it would reopen in April. This move eliminates the need for the aid to first go to Kerem Shalom, which until now has been the primary Israeli inspection point. This development comes as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is visiting the region, amid urgent efforts to secure a deal that would release some of the hostages taken by Hamas and prevent an imminent Israeli offensive in the southern city of Rafah. Over 1 million Gazans are currently taking shelter in Rafah, and aid officials are concerned that such an operation could erase humanitarian gains and put hundreds of thousands of people back in harm's way. The issue of Gazans' access to aid and the safety of civilians have become major points of contention between the Biden administration and Netanyahu's far-right government. This follows Israel's military response to the Hamas cross-border attacks that resulted in the death of 1,200 people. Palestinian authorities report that more than 34,000 people have been killed in Gaza during this period. The deteriorating conditions in Gaza have compelled the United States, Israel's closest ally and main supporter, to implement costly and potentially risky measures. The U.S. military has conducted over 30 airdrops of humanitarian aid into the territory and is constructing a floating pier and causeway off Gaza's coast to deliver aid by sea. Tensions escalated after an April 1st airstrike by Israel's military killed 7 people working for World Central Kitchen, leading Biden to issue an ultimatum that threatened to change U.S. policy and potentially condition or suspend military aid. While the number of aid trucks crossing into Gaza has significantly increased since then, the volume has not yet returned to pre-war levels, and aid officials say a host of issues further jeopardize the already critical conditions there. A key complaint is that the inspection and transport system remains burdensome, requiring aid to be offloaded and reloaded multiple times as it is moved across the border and to civilians inside Gaza. Aid agencies have also reported that Israeli authorities reject materials and aid shipments due to concerns that items may be used for military purposes. The UNRWA states that in addition to trucks and drivers, it also requires about 3 times the amount of fuel that it is receiving to operate its distribution network. The situation is most dire in northern Gaza. According to Abir Edifa, a spokeswoman for the UN World Food Program, increasing aid shipments had allowed the program to double what it had been able to deliver to northern Gaza in April. The agency has reopened 4 bakeries in Gaza City. The immediate impact of increased aid flow into Gaza City is visible, but the situation remains critical, particularly in areas like Beit Hanun and Beit Lahia in the far north of Gaza. A famine doesn't occur or get resolved overnight, and the situation is still dire in these regions. Philippe Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, highlighted that while the agency is allowed to operate normally in some areas, aid convoys moving from south to north are consistently denied. This, coupled with the hot weather, is making conditions increasingly difficult for displaced families living in tents. Scott Paul, Associate Director for Peace and Security with Oxfam America, pointed out that Oxfam and other aid agencies have had supplies turned away by Israeli authorities, who he believes are largely responsible for the distribution issues in Gaza. He emphasized that the UN, while responsible for coordinating the delivery of aid within Gaza, cannot do so effectively in the current environment of orchestrated chaos, insecurity, and deprivation. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, during his visit to Israel, stated that he would discuss with Israeli officials their system for prohibiting certain materials from being transported into Gaza. He stressed the importance of having a clear, well-understood list of essential items required for the well-being of people in Gaza, and to avoid arbitrary denials of products that need to get into Gaza. Blinken's visit comes at a time when there are indications that Hamas and Israel could be nearing a deal that would see some of the estimated 130 remaining hostages freed in return for a pause in fighting and a release of Palestinian prisoners. However, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed that the military will proceed with its operations, with or without a deal, to achieve total victory. This presents a political dilemma for Netanyahu, who is under pressure from far-right members of his coalition not to give any concessions to Hamas. Meanwhile, Hamas is under pressure to accept a deal, which Blinken has described as extraordinarily generous. A Hamas delegation has left Cairo and will return with a written response to the latest proposal. Despite these ongoing negotiations, the situation in Gaza remains critical, with the UN warning that at least a quarter of Gaza's population is one step away from famine.